Hello and welcome to the Daily Brief Show by Zerodha. Here we cut through the noise and simplify the biggest stories and trends that are shaping the markets. I'm your host Anurag Bansal. Today is Wednesday, the 28th of August, and I have three big stories for you. By the way, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you consume your podcasts. And if you like reading instead of watching or listening, you can also subscribe to our no spam newsletter for a very quick rundown. You can find all the links in the description given below. So let's start with the stories. I first talk about how foreign investors are very interested in government bonds. In the second story, I go on to talk about how Bangladesh is not paying electricity bills to India. And in the third story, I talk about the ULI or a UPI-like interface but for loans. So let's begin. See, in September 2021, JP Morgan announced that it would include Indian government bonds worth over $330 billion in notional values in its emerging markets bond indices. JP Morgan set the weight for Indian bonds at 10%, but the inclusion would happen over the course of the next 10 months, starting from the end of June 2024 to March of 2025. Now, this inclusion would have led to the inflow of about 25 billion US dollars. Now, this was a historic moment for India because the RBI had always been wary of allowing foreign investors to invest in Indian government bonds due to concerns over sudden inflows, outflows, and the impact on the rupee. Now, even though foreign investors could theoretically invest in Indian government bonds, there were many conditions attached, like holding period requirements, quotas, etc., and these made them very less popular. When the bond inclusion was announced, India had one of the lowest foreign ownership of Indian government bonds at just 1%, which is the lowest among comparable emerging markets. So the RBI created a new route for foreign investors to invest in Indian government bonds without any restrictions. And this was the key reason why JP Morgan decided to include Indian government bonds into its debt indices. Now, JP Morgan announced the inclusion of bonds in September 2023. So from October 2023 to August 2024, foreign investors have invested 1.4 lakh crores into Indian government bonds. Excluding the month of April 2024, there have been continuous net inflows into Indian government bonds from October 2023 to August 2024. Now, you might be wondering, if the inclusion was set to start from the end of June 2024, why am I sharing data from October 2023? Well, it's not like all investors will wait till June to invest. Only the passive funds that track the index would have waited until June 2024, but there are other active investors who invest in Indian government bonds as well. And these investors pretty much front ran the announcement. Now just look at the data from July and August. Foreign investors have bought 35,200 crores worth of Indian government bonds. Thanks to these inflows, foreign ownership of eligible bonds in the new route has increased to over 4.5% from 2.7% before inclusion. If you look at the foreign ownership of Indian government bonds as a percentage of all bonds outstanding, it has increased from about 1.4% before inclusion to about 2.5% according to Reuters data. Now, of course, all this money coming in has had an impact on the Indian government bonds yield as well. The yields on a 10-year bond has fallen from about 7.15% in September 2023 to 6.85% as of August 2024. Of course, this is not the only factor that influences government bond yields. Other factors like future inflation expectations, sentiment, demand and supply, and economic data also have a strong impact. On a side note though, it is interesting that the 10-year bond yield has already fallen to 6.8% even before the RBI starts cutting interest rates. Now that makes me wonder, how much juice is really left if one were to trade in government bond yields expecting a rate cut? But all in all though, falling yields are good for Indian companies because corporate bond yields are influenced by government bond yields. If government bond yields fall, then companies can issue corporate bonds at lower interest rates. Lower government bond yields also influence lending rates in the money markets where companies borrow for short term, ranging from overnight to 1 year as well. Moving on to the next story, let's talk about Bangladesh and its electricity bill problems. See, by now I'm sure most of us know about Bangladesh's recent problems. Massive protests over poor economic conditions and jobs led to the resignation of its longest serving Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina. There is a temporary government right now that is presiding over the country and elections are scheduled to be held soon. So Bangladesh right now is in a really bad shape. Now, considering Bangladesh is one of our closest neighbors, both politically and geographically, geographically, any trouble there is bound to cause some headache for Indian companies as well. To give you some context, India and Bangladesh had a bilateral trade worth 14 billion US dollars in the last financial year. The peak unrest in the country a few months ago affected many Indian companies like Marico, Imami, Hero Motors, etc. to varying degrees. Things, however, seem to be getting better, and many companies have now started to resume operations after the interim government took over. But there are two sectors that are still very heavily affected by the Bangladesh crisis: power and healthcare. According to a recent news report, Bangladesh's newly appointed governor, Ehsan H. Mansoor, revealed that the country owes Adani Power as much as 6,700 crore rupees for supplying power. For context, Adani Power did sales of 14,956 crores last quarter. According to a Bloomberg article, Bangladesh now owes $2 billion to everyone from airlines to power plants and even others. Bangladesh's foreign exchange reserves have fallen to a record low of $20 billion from as much as $48 billion in 2021. Now, this is just enough to cover about 3 months of imports. This means if Bangladesh does not start making more money from exports, taxes, etc., it'll go broke. So it's almost safe to say that Bangladesh right now does not have enough money to pay for power at this point. To overcome this, the interim Bangladesh government is trying to get an additional $3 billion in emergency aid from the IMF or the International Monetary Fund. For your context, countries usually go to the IMF only when they face severe problems. Think of IMF as the money lender of last resort. The IMF provides loans with conditions to help stabilize a particular country's economy. The overall goal of the IMF is to help countries recover economically quickly. Also, interestingly, Bangladesh does not owe money only to the Adani Group. Other major Indian power companies such as SEIL Energy, NTPC, and Power Grid also have dues worth millions of dollars. However, the Bangladesh unrest is just not persistently affecting power companies. Pharma companies and medical tourism have also suffered heavily. I'll explain. About 7% of tourists who visited India in 2023 were medical tourists. These people visited India to get medical treatment. This is usually done to save on cost, to receive better medical care, or to access specific medical procedures. As per data from the Government of India, approximately 25% of all tourists who visit India every year are from Bangladesh. What is more interesting is that over 50% of tourists visiting India for medical reasons are from Bangladesh, and all of this has taken a big hit after the recent political unrest. A spokesperson from Fortis Healthcare, which is the listed hospital chain, told ET that foreign patients in some of their hospitals have dropped by up to 50% ever since the Bangladesh problem started. Even other listed hospital chains, especially those in east of India, reported a significant drop in foreign patients. Now, this problem is not restricted to medical tourism alone. It has also significantly impacted India's pharma industry. See, India is a major supplier of pharmaceutical ingredients to Bangladesh. In fact, Bangladesh gets a bulk of its pharmaceutical ingredients from Indian pharma companies like Sun Pharma and Davis Labs. So all of that has gone into turmoil. All in all, Bangladesh is certainly in a bad shape right now, and considering the hyper-connected nature of all our economies today, the hope is that things settle down towards stability as soon as possible. Moving on to the third and the last story for the day, let's talk about ULI, or the Unified Lending Interface. See, when someone applies for a loan today, banks and NBFCs try to figure out if you are worth giving a loan to and what interest rates to charge. To do this, lenders check your credit score, your financial statements like bank statements, ITR, land records, etc. But the problem here is that all these records are very scattered across different places. Gathering them is not only a time-consuming process, it also leads to additional costs, which is eventually passed back to the borrowers in the form of processing fees, etc. Now, even if a lender claims to charge zero processing fees, they try to recover these costs through the interest rate. Now, what if there was one central place that lenders could fetch all this data from? Well, that is exactly what the RBI governor recently announced. He launched something called the ULI, or the Unified Lending Interface. With ULI, the RBI is hoping to do what UPI did for payments. ULI basically allows lenders to pull various statements and records from different places easily with the consent of the borrower. The goal is to reduce the time and the cost that is taken to check the creditworthiness of a borrower today. However, the specifics are still unclear, and we will still have to wait for operational specifics and guidelines to understand more about how this works. Based on what we know today, though, it feels very similar to UPI. This means lenders can plug into this consent-based system to access records. Now, something that is confusing here is that the ONDC, or the Open Network for Digital Commerce, is also trying to solve this problem of credit. ONDC has been working to onboard banks and NBFCs. It recently announced that people can get loans through ONDC within 6 minutes. Then there's also Open Credit Enablement Network, or OCEN, which wanted to make borrowing easy for micro, small, and medium enterprises. Both these platforms were largely conceptualized by the same people that also designed the UPI. Now look, there aren't a whole lot of details on ULI right now, so I'm making an assumption that ONDC and OCEN are trying to solve some of the same problems as ULI. And if my assumption is right, and that is indeed the case, then why is there a need for all these platforms and protocols? I don't have an answer today, but only time will tell, I guess. That's all the news I have for you today. I hope you found value in this episode. I'll see you tomorrow. Take care and goodbye.